Hi everybody and welcome to Safe Diving. So the winner of this week's vote was for me to take a closer look at diving torches and all of their features and options. If you voted for something else, then of course don't worry, it's still on the list and maybe next week will be your week. So dive torches. Torches are widely seen as an essential tool to bring with you on every single dive, not just your night dives. My very first dive torch was a UK 400 lumen torch, and I remember everybody else commenting just how bright it was compared to their torches. Man, how times have changed. So a good dive torch won't just shine some light to show your way in the dark, but it will actually make you stand out in the water so that others can see you and how you're doing. So diving in low visibility or in the dark, your torch beam is a great means of communication and seeing what your buddy is doing. Your buddy's torch beam actually shows exactly where their eyes are looking, and if you want to get hold of their attention, just shine your beam across theirs. Torches have got me out of a lot of separations where when you turn around, the only thing that you can see is your buddy's torch. A torch isn't just so that you can see on a night dive, it's so that you can be seen. So let's take a closer look at dive torches. The first stat that most divers look at when buying a torch or a light is the lumens, which is basically how bright the torch is. A few manufacturers like to mix things up and sort of rate their lights in lux or some other type of metric, because measuring light output is actually quite tricky and has a whole lot of variables, but lumens tends to be the most sort of standard unit now. 400 lumens isn't that much nowadays, but for a night dive in clear blue waters, it's about all you really need, to be honest. Much more than 400, and I find it a little bit too bright. You shine that on the any sort of patch of white sand and you're just going to ruin your night vision and just blind yourself. If you shine it in your buddy's eyes by mistake, then you'll be the one buying the drinks at the bar. So you're also shining your torch on the marine life, which of course temporarily blinds them, so you don't want anything too sort of bright. So realistically, if you're looking for a torch just to go on a night dive, then 400-500 lumens should do you fine. If you dive in greener waters with poor visibility, then you want something more in the kind of 1000 lumen kind of range minimum, so it can pierce through the water so that you can see and of course be seen. Anything over 2000 lumens can be a bit overkill though. It's a bit like high beam in a snowstorm. You kind of illuminate everything around you and you can't see anything behind it. And I actually tend to turn my torch down from its maximum diving, for its maximum power whilst diving in poor visibility. It still does the job, you don't need the full high beam. You can often see just as much, if not more, just in the kind of the lower settings. But it is nice to have that sort of brighter option. The benefit of anything over 2000 lumens is really in you being seen. You will stand out like a lighthouse if you shine your light at a search boat or a helicopter with 2000 lumens attached to you. You're really going to stand out in the water. For photos and videos, the numbers just go up and up to the tens of thousands, but that's because they're spreading it over a wide area. 5000 lumens is a pretty good place for recreational video. It pumps out a lot of light to eliminate shadows and bring the colors back to the reds, but it's all spread out evenly, so it's less like a laser pointer just burning someone's retina and more like a floodlight that kind of illuminates everything. For general day-to-day use, go for a spotlight. For photos and videos, just go for the floodlight. But now, by using sort of lenses and multiple LEDs, you can actually pick and choose in the water. But I'm going to talk about beam angles later. Primary and backup are pretty vague terms that are different for all divers and locations and torches. There's no real defining feature that makes a primary torch or a backup torch a backup. Everything about scuba diving is usually focused on redundancy, where if your primary fails, you have a backup to rely on. Your primary torch is usually your more powerful torch or your fancier torch, and in the unlikely event that your primary torch should fail for whatever reason, your backup should get you out of trouble. Now, I've been diving on a night dive alone when my torch has flooded. It's a bad scenario. All I really knew was that my torch had stopped working. It was only later that sort of when I found a small puddle inside of it that it had leaked. It was a prototype torch that I was testing out, and I didn't actually bring a spare, so when it died I just had nothing. Luckily it was no big deal. It was a pretty bright night, but I would have felt a lot better if I had a backup torch. Now, I always dive with a backup torch, but on certain dives my backup torch actually becomes my primary, and for a lot of dives my backup torch is going to be more powerful than a lot of other divers' primary torches. But I always bring at least one torch with me on all dives, just in case I need to peer into some dark corner of the reef or inside of a shipwreck. So if you're looking for a new torch, you probably won't see anything actually named as a primary or as a backup torch, except the far sort of ends of the spectrums. The really sort of cheap small ones, they're going to be your backup torches, and the really big sort of fancy ones, they're going to be your primaries. Realistically, anything can be a primary and anything can be a backup. It's just your primary is usually a bit fancier. I mean, for example, we've got these ones here. So if we take this torch and this little torch, you'd imagine that this would be the primary and then this would be your backup because of the kind of size difference. Actually, this one is far more powerful than this torch, so it would actually be the other way around, but I'd never use that as a backup torch because backup torches are usually hidden away, sort of tucked away in a pocket or clipped off to a D-ring, so it's usually the small torches that end up being the backup. So they're kind of vague terms, but realistically your primary torch is your most powerful, and then your backup is something that can be equally powerful, but more often than not it's a little bit less powerful, but it does the job. Most dive torches are just handheld, like this guy or this guy. Nothing overly fancy. They're a longish tube that you hold in your hand and just look like a torch or a flashlight. But they do take up one of your hands, so you can't sign so easily with this hand. And pointing a torch isn't the most natural, so a few options have evolved. So the first is a lantern grip. The torch is still pretty tubular, but it's a lot chunkier because it has a larger battery inside it, so it's actually a lot harder to hold on to. So they invented a parallel handle along the top, which means you can hold it a bit like an 18th century coal miner, but yeah, you don't see too many of these in the water anymore. Pistol grip, like this guy, it sounds exactly sort of how it sounds, or is exactly how it sounds. It's got this kind of drop down pistol handle which feels quite natural in the hand, but again, these are becoming quite old fashioned as technology has kind of evolved. Batteries and bulbs have become much smaller, so you don't really need anything as big or bulky anymore, so you don't see too many of these neither. Modern torches now have Goodman style handles which attaches to the torch to the which attaches the torch to the back of your hands, just like this guy. If I just put this on quickly, like so. So these are, they basically are a way of making your sort of torch hands free, and your fingers are still free to do stuff while still holding onto the torches. The older ones are still pretty rigid and still consist of a solid metal handle with a torch head kind of bolted onto it, but now you can find variations from a fabric one like this one that are a bit more form-fitting and adjustable to the size of your hands, to modern hinge designs that let you change the handle height and the width as well, depending on the size of your hands and of course your gloves, so they don't sort of rattle around or feel loose when you're holding onto it. The torch just kind of sits exactly where you want it. This is how my primary sort of sits on, and if I don't need it, then I can just clip it off to a D-ring. It's just as easy to sort of take it off and then clip it off onto something. So they're very sort of practical. I do like Goodman style handles. Always have some kind of lanyard or a sort of bolt snap attached onto your torch so you can clip it off and kind of forget about it for a moment without worrying about losing it or dropping it. As a general rule of thumb, most torches sink, and you can watch them sink all the way down. The battery inside the torch is very important to take note of when you're buying a torch. A lot of dive torches are now fitted with rechargeable batteries, which are either factory fitted, so you can't actually remove them, or they're removable and you charge the battery up in some kind of cradle, or they have an external battery pack that kind of sits on your hip or even behind you. Your other choice is, of course, single-use batteries, which is usually the cheapest option, especially in the kind of initial capital, and they can actually offer the best performance depending on your battery choice. With user changeable batteries, you need a couple of considerations. The first one is the battery size. Are they a standard size? Are they easy to get, like AA or sort of standard C size battery? And of course, how expensive are they? The last thing you need is to buy a torch and then find that they only take an obscure size battery that you can only buy online. Like, you can get half AA batteries and whatnot, or CR123s. They're quite a popular size, but they're not the easiest to get hold of. You can't just go down to sort of the local supermarket. They don't always stock them. Also check the output of the battery that you buy. There's a reason why some batteries are much more expensive than others. Even if your torch is built to kick out 2000 lumens, if you put a rubbish battery inside of it, it could actually have half of the output. And of course, the 2000 lumen rating is actually measured with the fancy batteries. So by putting a cheap battery in it, you only have a 1500 or 1000 lumen torch. You also need to think about the seal. Every single time that you change the batteries, you are rubbing the watertight O-ring seals, which can damage them, leading to water ingress and having to buy a new dive torch. It's best to grease them a little bit so that they don't get twisted and damaged, but yeah, don't add too much. Don't just slap it on. You only want a small film of sort of grease, because hair and grit can stick to it and cause a leak. So if you're considering a replaceable battery torch, consider the upkeep and sort of check to see if it comes with any spare O-rings. And every time you change the batteries, check that O-ring over just in case it's sort of starting to wear, because the next sort of telltale sort of sign that something's going wrong is when it stops working and you have to drain it out. And flooding caused by sort of knackered O-rings isn't covered by the warranty neither, I can tell you that much. So yeah, that's very much seen as user error. Rechargeable batteries are a great alternative, and a lot of them allow you to sort of top them up just with a USB cable now. The best kind are factory sealed. They're sealed inside of the torches, so they have a sort of built-in battery that you charge up through the body of the torch, so you never have to worry about O-rings and sort of water ingress. So this one, for example, there's no way of opening it. It doesn't open in any way unless you use some proper tools. But this one, these two sort of gold contacts, you just get a little sort of cable that sort of magnetically clips onto that, and that's what recharges it. There's no sort of pluggy things. There's no sort of worry about changing O-rings or sort of greasing them. It's that's it. So it's a very, very low maintenance torch. Now, if you have looked after your torch and you haven't been dragging it around through the gravel or dropped it down the stairs, then if your torch should flood, and it's obviously not your fault, then a lot of the time they'll actually fix it for you. Now that's obviously not a promise, there are a lot of caveats, but factory sealed torches usually are the least nonsense. Removable rechargeable batteries give you the option to carry spares, so you don't have to worry about waiting for the battery to charge up, but you do get the same O-ring problem again every time you change the batteries. Another choice, if you want something really powerful with a sensible burn time or to run something else from it, can be a canister battery that sits on your hip. These means that you can have a huge battery but not have a huge clunky torch to hold in your hand. They allow for very high outputs for longer times, but you will have a cable or an umbilical that leads to the head of the torch. These can also be quite handy because if you do ever drop the head of the torch, it's physically attached by a cable. So they're a good option. They're not the cheapest though. They are fairly expensive, but you do also have to have this kind of canister on your hip or sort of somewhere behind you. Yeah, they can also allow you to run something else from them. From if you have one big battery, you can run your torch and something like a heated vest if you're diving in a dry suit. So yeah, they do become sort of multi-purpose, these sort of canister batteries. A lot of newer torches are featuring overpressure valves that are small little one-way valves that allow any expanding gases to escape from inside of the torch body. Now realistically, the only time where this is likely to happen is if water gets in, and when seawater mixes with lithium-ion batteries, it produces gas, which normally meant that your torch was sort of only suitable for the bin because pressure would build up inside, so you couldn't physically open that torch up, and if you ever did, it would just go bang to open up. So an overpressure valve means that you can actually open up the torch and dry out the inside, and if you're very lucky, you get to use that torch again, just only with a new battery. There are about 5, maybe 6 choices of switches, and all of them have their pros and their cons. The first one is the most basic, and that's the twist. You'll either twist the head or the bottom of the torch to turn it on and off. So like this guy, as you rotate the head, it switches on, and then you sort of rotate the whole thing back and it switches off. So these are the simplest to use, but they mean that your torch sort of typically only has one setting on. Sometimes torches may have a sort of setting based on how quickly you turn it on and off in quick succession. It can change the power setting, but they're not very practical, and you kind of have to remember, oh, you have to do it 3 times in quick succession to get it to 50%. It's really not worth your time. Same problem as the batteries. The more you use them, the more you actually wear that O-ring down, or worse, if you unscrew it all the way, you can literally pull the torch apart underwater and watch the very last bubble bloop out of it. Bloop. A better variant of this is a collar. So it has a rotating collar around the head, and that sort of rotates around it. On the inside will be a little magnet at 1 or 2 points that sort of lines up with switches on the inside of the torch. I quite like these. It's tricky to change the setting accidentally. If you have a button, sometimes you can press it and not notice, but with a rotating collar, it's pretty tricky. And it's actually very easy to choose from multiple functions, even if you're wearing clunky gloves. Again, with buttons, big clunky gloves aren't the most practical. Turny switches are okay. You can find a couple of these, the flat magnetic kind, which just kind of pivot, which do the job, or you can get sort of the pushy, slidey ones. But the magnets have to line up, and they can rust over time, depending on the design, obviously. Some are sort of protected, but there have been some that are just exposed, and then after a few years, yeah, the magnet just disintegrates. You can also find the fancier toggle switches, which are much nicer, but you only tend to find these on sort of canister lights. Actual physical buttons, they are good, but they usually have moving parts, so you have to keep them clean so they don't jam up. This one, for example, this has a little button on it, so there is some movement in that sort of button, but But yeah, if you sort of don't sort of keep it clean, sort of salt can sort of build up inside of it, and it just makes it a little bit stiff. So you just have to give it a good wash to sort of loosen it up. Over time, yeah, they just get sort of stiff, and sometimes you have to really sort of press them hard to sort of loosen them up. They can also have sort of magnets inside of them so that there's no moving parts that go through the body of the torch. Again, it's another way for water to get in, so they use magnets. So yeah, just keep them clean, just in case it sort of rusts. You see, just like the sort of turny switches on the inside of the torch, there'll be a little reed switch with two thin wires next to one another, that as the magnet gets close to them, it brings the wires together and activates the circuit, so you don't have anything that actually goes through the body of the torch, which could cause a flood. Piezo switches are a bit like buttons that use magic to tell when you've actually pressed them. Now, they don't have any moving parts on the outside, but when your finger or even a gloved hand touches the surface, it knows somehow. So these are amazing. You don't get the same positive feedback of something physically moving, but you also don't get the complications that come from moving parts. This torch, for example, if you can see here, there is a button, but there's no, it's underneath this sort of plastic. So as I sort of press it with my finger, it somehow registers that I'm pressing it with my finger, but there's no moving parts. I know it's something to do with electrical fields and stuff, but it still works through some neoprene gloves, so I have no idea how that works, but they are very, very clever. The final one that you can find is kinetic. Now, you don't see too many of these sort of out there, because whilst they're very clever, they're quite complicated too, and a little bit temperamental. So on the inside they have an accelerometer which registers when and how you move them, but they're not perfect. You feel a bit like you're trying to make your phone go into widescreen and just kind of trying to shake it in one direction. This torch, for example, so this, you might have seen as I moved it, the screen comes on, but you dial it up, or is it this way? Oh, sorry, it's locked, so you have to unlock it first by pointing it downwards, and then as you turn it on, it sort of dials up, and then as you do it anti-clockwise, it gets dimmer, and then facing downwards, you do it anti-clockwise, and that should switch it off. So it's clever. It means it's sort of pretty hands-free, especially if you have it in a Goodman style handle, but there are some moments where you're just sort of sat in the water and you just look like you don't know what you're doing with your torch. So they're clever, but yeah, they're not 100% yet. Most dive lights are LEDs now. Years ago you had all sorts of different bulbs and HIDs and all sorts of things, but now everything tends to be LEDs because they have pretty good lifetimes and they have really good outputs compared to the power that they actually require. The type of LEDs, in my experience, doesn't really matter that much. You'll find all sorts of Cree XML2s and Cree XPEs and sort of all sorts out there, but I've never really been able to look at a torch and go, oh, that's obviously a Cree XPL. Some will have different color temperatures, but they don't really matter too much unless you're seriously into your photography or your videography. The light temperature is literally sort of how yellow or pure white the light is actually being produced. So your photos and videos feel sort of warmer, like sunlight if you get a sort of a yellower temperature, or it can be sort of cooler and more clinical depending on sort of what you need. But for everyday diving and a normal like spotlight torch, it really doesn't matter that much. For photos, you can often find red filters as well, and actual bulbs, red bulbs, that this is actually to help with marine life more than putting reds back into your photos and videos. You can of course use them that way if you really want to, but as you know, red light gets absorbed by seawater and water in general, and a lot of marine life hasn't actually evolved to be able to see red wavelength, because why would they if there's very little down there? So you can shine red light on them and it doesn't startle them because they actually can't quite see it. This actually allows you to light your shot and line everything up without disturbing the fish. You can pull focus and everything and then take your photo. Your flash is still going to blind the poor little fish, but until sort of after you've taken the photo, yeah, it's not going to know you're there. Blue lights are pretty new on the market and they're often called UV, only they're technically not actually UV, or at least they shouldn't be. UV lights are actually quite bad, they're quite dangerous for your eyes and obviously for animals' eyes, but we have found a certain wavelength, a little outside of the UV, in the blue wavelength, which can actually excite certain proteins in marine life to make them glow new and never before seen patterns that are usually invisible to the naked eye. Now they often need a yellow filter to get the full effect, just like CSI, so you get these special goggles, so they'll often come with, yeah, that sort of mask and sort of camera yellowish filter. These are cool, but they're in no way essential. They're just a bit of fun that you can invest in if you kind of have everything else and you kind of want to see some sort of photo bioluminescence. Also nestled in with some sort of photo lights, you'll sometimes see a small black dot next to the LEDs, which is actually a light sensor, and this can have a couple of functions. The first one is that it measures the ambient light and actually turns your light up or down to match, so that your photos aren't overexposed, and sort of saves some battery power. If it's a little bit bright out, it just turns it down because you don't need it all. But it also is always looking for photo flashes, and if it sees a sudden flash, it will turn the light off for a couple of seconds, and this is actually quite smart. For photos, you'll use the floodlight to illuminate everything, but you really want the intense flash to be what lights your shot, but the floodlight could create sort of backscatter and other interference, so when it sees that preliminary flash, because they flash twice, it switches the floodlight off, so you actually get the perfect photo. It's very clever. Unless the fish obviously turns around, because that's what they always do in my photos. Three choices you have when it comes to beam angles. You get spotlight, floodlight, and adjustable. Spotlights are your everyday torches. They typically have beam angles kind of under 20 degrees, 25 degrees. They're normally around the kind of the 12 to 15 sort of range, and they focus all of their output into one small hotspot and maybe a bit of a corona around it. Most divers prefer these as sort of everyday torches because they can pierce through murky water and illuminate one thing in particular. You can also use your torch beam to communicate underwater, literally drawing a circle around something you want to draw your buddy's attention to, and actually crossing the streams means that you sort of want to get your buddy's attention. If they're looking at something and you know, because that's where their torch beam is focused, if you cross your light beam across theirs, it's really obvious and they know where it's coming from. Floodlights are better suited for photography and videography. They spread out their output evenly over a wide area in front of them so that everything is evenly illuminated. They typically have a wide beam angle around 100 degrees. The best will cast their light evenly over the entire area with no hot spots or sort of hard edges. If you want to sort of bring light and color back to your photographs and videos, then a cheap floodlight can actually ruin it. If the beam isn't sort of even, and you'll get a sort of hot spot where there's lots of light in one particular area, a warm area around it, and then just this solid hard edge where the light just stops, which just really stands out in photos and videos. Ideally, find a floodlight that makes it completely seamless with really soft edges. You can see someone with a floodlight coming from a mile off in the water as well, because if they're facing you, then their torch is shining in your face. They're lovely in blue water at night to illuminate the entire reef, but they tend to get lost elsewhere. Some torches let you twist the head to actually focus the light, so you can hop between the two and choose your own perfect beam angle to suit your needs. Others have sort of multiple bulbs, so sort of half turn on for a wide angle and the other half turn on for a spotlight, and if you turn them both on, you get a bit of a hybrid with a hotspot and a corona around it. These are your good sort of multi-function, so you do have that spotlight, but if you do want to just illuminate everything, you just rotate the head a little bit or flick a switch or do something, and then it turns into a floodlight. So these are quite clever. Some torches will be fitted with some kind of battery level indicator to tell you how much battery life you have left. The most basic will just be the odd flash. So you'll be swimming along with your torch and your torch will just blip on and off every now and then, and that's basically your torch telling you that you're down to 25 or 10% or whatever, basically whatever your manual will sort of tell you. If it suddenly flashes randomly, it's down to 10%. But you don't really see this too much, to be honest. Very few torches actually still have this feature. More common, you'll find a little circle or sort of LEDs around the button that have traffic light coloured sort of lights underneath it. So when you're at 100%, it glows green around the button. Down to 50%, that changes to amber. And when you get down to 25% or something, it turns red or something similar. The fanciest will have a readout like these guys, which literally kind of, it spells out how much battery life you have left. These are quite fancy, but yeah, you don't see them sort of too much. Now these battery level indicators, they can also double up as power level indication. So if you're on full beam and you didn't notice, it will illuminate like 3 indicators or green, and then down to 2 or amber if you switch it down to half power. Now, I've never really found these overly useful, to be honest. You can usually tell when you're at full beam or not, and it's not really a big deal to change it, so it's a bit of a waste of power in my eyes. You can find flashy beacons for divers, and they're kind of split into 2 categories. The find my way home flash and the please come help me and find me lost at sea kind of flash. So the first type is typically small and just attaches to a hang tank or your tank valve and just kind of blinks gently so that it or you kind of stands out in the water a little bit. They draw your eye quite nicely when you're looking for something. But if you're really lost at sea, the bigger strobes, they're a bit more like a camera flash for real high intensity flashes to really help you get found or to really stand out in the water. You also see a few sort of chemical glow sticks on scuba gear. We tend to use glow sticks quite a lot. They are single use, unfortunately. They glow for a few hours and they help you stand out at night because they come in all sorts of different colours. But once the chemical reaction inside runs its course, that's it. Straight to the bin. You can't even recycle them because they're just full of broken glass and pretty potent chemicals. I have no idea what's going on inside of a glow stick, but yeah, I wouldn't put it in the recycle bin. The newest ones that I've seen are lasers, which I don't actually know why we haven't seen them on the diving scene for so long. They only really came about a year or so ago. You'll either find waterproof laser pointers to, well, point at things without having to get too close at them. They're a real precise way of pointing at something instead of just a gloved hand kind of pointing as close as you want to get to that bobbit worm or whatever it is. But you can also find torch slash lasers, which is just a torch with a laser pointer built into it. Of course, just remember not to shine in anybody's eyes, human or fish. But they are a very clever solution, which could mean that sort of more divers kind of keep their distance from the reef whilst trying to sort of point something out. They won't feel the need to sort of really get close into that little nudibranch and then sort of get caught up and hit something, and then everyone else is crowding around. So a laser pointer might be quite a clever way to sort of, yeah, get everyone to keep their distance. Okay, so that was a closer look at torches. Yeah, they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. As with anything, metal tends to trump plastic. It's just that little bit stronger, but it does mean it's a bit more expensive. The brighter you go, the more expensive it is. But I find myself anything over, yeah, sort of 400 or 500 lumens, I end up turning it down, or at least sort of covering it up a little bit whilst I'm on a night dive in blue water, because it's just too much and you just end up blinding yourself. But yeah, let me know which torch you like the look of, or which one you're thinking about investing in. If you want my opinion on it, let me know down in the comments below. As ever, thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving.